A 9-year-old boy walked into court to defend his mother, but what he uncovered shook the entire justice system. Watch till the end. Get this kid out of my courtroom. Now. Judge Harold Crenshaw's gavel slammed down like a hammer of finality, the sound echoing through the packed Montgomery County courtroom. His finger pointed sharply at the small figure standing in front of the defense table, a 9-year-old boy in an oversized brown suit that hung from his thin shoulders. The gallery burst into laughter. "Look at this little boy playing lawyer," someone sneered from the back. "Absolutely pathetic," muttered another. The bailiff, a heavy-set man with a buzz cut, began stomping towards the boy, his boots thudding against the polished floor. "Move it, kid," he barked. "You're embarrassing yourself." At the defense table, Sarah Thompson, the boy's mother, lunged forward, her voice trembling. "Please, Your Honor, he's just trying to help me." "Silence," Crenshaw roared. "I will not have a circus in my courtroom. Remove this child immediately before I cite you both for contempt." The laughter grew louder. Phone cameras came out, recording the spectacle. Someone began a slow, mocking clap. Through it all, the boy didn't move. His name was Malik Thompson, and though he barely reached the table's edge, his eyes were calm and unflinching. He waited until the noise subsided, then lifted his chin. "Your Honor," Malik said, his voice small but steady, "I invoke Federal Rule 17C. The laughter stopped instantly. Judge Crenshaw froze. His face turned pale. Lawyers in the front row exchanged startled glances. For a moment, the room was suspended in silence, because no one, not even Crenshaw himself, had expected those words. What happened next would expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the county's legal system. But to understand how a 9-year-old boy ended up facing the most powerful people in Montgomery County, we have to go back 3 weeks earlier. The Riverside apartment stood like a monument to neglect. Paint peeled off the walls like sunburned skin. The hallways smelled of mildew and despair. Brown water leaked from corroded pipes, staining ceilings and walls. The heating system had been broken for months, leaving families shivering through the cold Maryland winter. Inside, apartment 4B, Malik sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by towers of old law books, some taller than he was. He had found them years ago, thrown out behind the county law library. While other kids collected Pokemon cards, Malik collected knowledge. He traced his finger across a page lit by the dim glow of a single lamp. The cover read Tenant Rights and Civil Procedure. "Malik, baby, dinner's ready," his mother called from their tiny kitchen. "Comin', Mama," he replied, though his eyes didn't leave the page. A small chess set sat beside him, half played, both sides being moved by Malik himself. On the wall behind him hung sheets of paper covered in neat handwriting, definitions, statutes, court procedures. Sarah Thompson worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. At 28, exhaustion had carved dark hollows under her eyes, but she never let Malik see her break. She cleaned offices before dawn, stocked shelves at a grocery store by day, and delivered food for a restaurant until nearly midnight. Her dream was simple: to give her son a life better than hers. Their landlord, Preston Blackwell, was a name that made tenants whisper in fear. He owned more than 200 buildings across the city, all crumbling, all profitable. He was known for showing up in expensive suits and luxury cars, bragging about his business genius. In reality, his empire was built on neglect and exploitation. When pipes burst from age, he sued families for flooding his property. When walls cracked, he accused tenants of vandalism. When mold spread because of broken ventilation, he claimed residents were dirty. And presiding over nearly every one of his cases was Judge Harold Crenshaw, who, in 30 years on the bench, had never once ruled against a major landlord. What no one knew was that Crenshaw and Blackwell shared more than courtrooms. They shared golf games, charity galas, and quiet dinners at Pinehurst Country Club, all paid for by the Montgomery County Landlords Association, which Blackwell chaired. The game was rigged, and it worked until the Thompsons moved into apartment 4. B. Sarah had reported every problem in her home through the proper channels: the leaking pipes, the broken heat, the mold. She'd taken photographs, filed complaints, even called the city health department. 3 weeks later, a process server banged on their door before dawn, delivering an eviction notice. $50,000 in property damage, Sarah whispered in disbelief as she read the papers. Her hands shook. They're saying we destroyed the apartment. Malik studied the documents carefully, his eyes darting over every line of dense legal jargon. But the pictures, Mama, he said softly. That's the same damage that was already there when we moved in. Sarah sighed. I know, baby, but we can't afford a lawyer. And who's going to believe us over them? Malik's gaze hardened. Then we don't hire one, he said. We become one. That night, while his mother slept, Malik sat up under the flickering light, flipping through every book he owned. He studied property law, civil procedure, and federal housing regulations. He memorized words that most adults couldn't pronounce. And then he found something, a single paragraph buried deep in the text. Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 17C. A minor or incompetent person who does not have a duly appointed representative may sue by next friend. Malik's heart began to pound. It was a loophole, one that allowed him to stand in court on behalf of his mother under emergency circumstances. He whispered the words over and over like a prayer. Next friend, next friend. The next morning, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, pale and weary, the eviction notice trembling in her hand. If we fight this, we'll lose everything, she said. If we don't, we'll have no home. What are we supposed to do? Malik reached across the table, placing his small hand over hers. We fight, he said simply. In his eyes there was no doubt, only fire. The same fire that, 3 weeks later, would light up the cold marble courtroom of Montgomery County and force a corrupt judge to face the smallest, bravest lawyer the system had ever seen. The night after the eviction notice arrived, Malik could not sleep. The faint hum of the refrigerator filled the silence of their tiny apartment. His mother, Sarah, lay curled on the worn-out sofa, exhaustion etched deep into her face. She had cried herself to sleep, clutching the eviction papers to her chest like they were a death sentence. Malik sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a fortress of books, printouts, and loose pages covered with his tight, careful handwriting. The flickering lamp cast long shadows across the peeling wallpaper. His pencil moved rapidly, copying words from a heavy book titled Federal Civil Procedure and Housing Law. He whispered to himself as he wrote, Rule 17, next friend, incapacitated representative. His mind moved faster than his small hands could keep up. He knew the odds. A boy with no law degree, no resources, and no connections going up against a millionaire and a corrupt judge. It sounded impossible. But impossible didn't scare Malik. He had lived with impossible all his life. The next morning, Sarah returned from her first job with dark circles under her eyes and a cup of cheap gas station coffee in her trembling hand. She looked at her son, still awake, still surrounded by papers. Malik, baby, you haven't slept, she said softly. I found something, Mama, he said, his eyes gleaming. It's a law that lets me represent you. It's called next friend representation. It's for people who can't defend themselves. You're sick, you're tired, and they're taking advantage of that. But I can help." Sarah smiled faintly, her heart breaking at his determination. "Baby, no one's going to let a 9-year-old argue in court. Then they'll have to show me the rule that says I can't," Malik said. 3 days later, Malik took his first step into the Montgomery County Courthouse. The air smelled like paper, old coffee, and fear. Adults in suits rushed past him, barely glancing at the tiny boy clutching a briefcase nearly as big as his torso. Behind the front counter sat Mrs. Patterson, the court clerk who had worked there for over 2 decades. Her reading glasses rested on the tip of her nose as she flipped through a stack of case files. "Hi," Malik said politely, placing a thick folder on the counter. "I need to file a pro se motion for next friend representation in the case of Thompson versus Blackwell Properties." The clerk looked up, blinking. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" "I'm here to file a motion, ma'am," Malik repeated. "Under Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 17C." Mrs. Patterson frowned. "Sweetheart, where are your parents? You can't file legal documents." "With respect," Malik interrupted gently, "could you please show me the specific statute or rule that says there's an age requirement for next friend representation?" The clerk froze, mouth half open. Around them, people began to notice. A security guard turned his head. A woman waiting in line whispered to her coworker, "Is that kid serious?" Malik continued, calm and respectful. "The law says that a person who lacks capacity to sue can sue by a next friend. My mother's currently suffering from stress-related illness caused by this lawsuit. That means she can't fully represent herself right now. I can act as her next friend." Mrs. Patterson stammered, "Well, I'll need to ask my supervisor." "That's fine, ma'am," Malik said, "but please note that refusing a properly filed motion without legal justification could violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment." 20 minutes later, Mrs. Patterson returned, pale and wide-eyed, carrying a large rubber stamp. She placed it on his paperwork and pressed down hard. "Your motion is accepted," she said quietly. "Court date's next Friday, 9 a.m., Judge Crenshaw's courtroom." Malik smiled for the first time in days. "Thank you for your professionalism, ma'am." When he turned to leave, several people in the lobby were staring at him, some shaking their heads, others smiling in disbelief. Word spread fast. By evening, tenants from other Blackwell properties were calling Sarah's phone. They had heard about the kid lawyer. "Mrs. Thompson, my stairs have been broken for 6 months," cried Mrs. Rodriguez from Building C. "When I complained, they threatened to evict me." "I got no heat all winter," said Mr. Washington, a retired bus driver. "He's suing me too. Said I ruined the boiler." Sarah could barely keep up with the calls. "I don't know what my boy started," she whispered, half afraid, half proud. Malik, meanwhile, sat at the kitchen table surrounded by new evidence. Photographs, inspection reports, old maintenance requests. He used a ruler to line them up neatly, cross-referencing every date and signature. "See this, Mama?" he said, pointing to one paper. "These inspection reports were filed before we even moved in. The same cracks, the same stains. It's all here." Sarah looked at him with tears in her eyes. "You sound like a lawyer already." "I just sound like someone who's tired of watching people get stepped on," Malik said softly. The following week, Malik spent every spare minute studying. After finishing his homework, he memorized property codes, read court transcripts, and watched public hearings online. The local librarian had begun setting aside law journals for him, labeling them reserved for the young attorney. But the stress was beginning to show. One night, Sarah came home from her delivery job and found Malik asleep at the table, his face pressed into a pile of papers, his pencil still in his hand. She covered him with a blanket, whispering, "You shouldn't have to carry this, baby. It's too much." Yet, in her heart, she knew there was no stopping him now. 2 days before the hearing, Malik sat in the public library long after sunset. The night guard, an older man named Mr. Lewis, was locking up when he noticed the boy still bent over a pile of documents. "Still studying, huh?" Lewis said, chuckling. "You know it's past closing time, right?" "Please, sir," Malik said, eyes never leaving the page. "Just 5 more minutes." Lewis sighed. "You remind me of me when I was your age, except I wasn't half as smart." He set down a candy bar next to Malik. "Don't tell anyone I broke the rules for you." "Thank you, Mr. Lewis." When Malik finally looked up, his fingers stopped on a page that made his pulse quicken. It was a city inspection report for their building, dated 3 months before they moved in. The report listed every single issue Blackwell now blamed them for. The same leaks, the same mold, the same structural damage. Malik's heart pounded. He flipped through more pages, dozens of similar reports from other Blackwell buildings. It was a pattern, a cycle. He would buy run-down apartments, document the damage, and then hide those reports before renting to new families. When problems inevitably resurfaced, he sued them. It wasn't negligence, it was fraud. Malik sat back in his chair, staring at the papers spread before him. The weight of what he had just uncovered pressed down on his small shoulders. If he brought this to court, it wouldn't just save his mother. It would expose the entire system. He packed the papers into his briefcase carefully, whispering, "Tomorrow we start fighting for real." Back home, Sarah was waiting by the window, worry creasing her face. "Where were you, baby? I've been scared to death." "I found something, Mama," Malik said, breathless. "Proof, real proof." He opened his briefcase and spread the papers across the table. "This isn't just about us. He's been doing this to everyone. We can stop him." Sarah looked at the papers, then at her son, this small, brilliant boy who carried the courage of a grown man. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" she asked quietly. Malik nodded. "I was born ready." Outside, the city slept under a blanket of cold, silent stars. But in apartment 4B, the light stayed on. A child sat at a table building a case that would soon shake the walls of a courthouse and change the meaning of justice forever. By dawn, the apartment looked less like a home and more like a war room. The kitchen table was buried under neat stacks of paper, inspection reports, maintenance requests, lease addenda, and Malik's handwritten timelines that marched in pencil across yellow legal pads. The lamp's cone of light cut a small island through the gray of early morning. Sarah stood quietly in the doorway, wrapped in her coat, watching her son work with the patience of a clockmaker. "Eat something, baby," she said at last, setting a piece of toast beside his notes. "In a minute," Malik murmured, eyes locked on 2 photographs placed side by side. Same crack, same angle, 3 months apart, but before we moved in on both. He slid a ruler along the edges until the frames aligned perfectly. They didn't just know about the damage, they documented it. Sarah came closer, tracing the caption dates with a fingertip, and then blamed us for it. Malik nodded. "And for the Rodriguez family, and for Mr. Washington. It's a pattern, Mama. A system." He clipped the photos into a plastic sleeve labeled Exhibit Z, pre-tenancy conditions, and added it to a binder whose spine he'd taped and retaped. The cover read, in blocky pen, "Thompson v. Blackwell. Evidence." The library had become his second home. In the hush between stacks of municipal records and bound case reporters, Malik learned the rhythms of the building. When the copy machine cooled, when the night guard, Mr. Lewis, made his rounds. Which drawer of the filing cabinet stuck unless you pulled it from the bottom right corner. He wore a trail between the public records terminal and the microfilm reader by the window, feeding dimes into the printer until his pockets were light. He built spreadsheets by hand: dates, addresses, unit numbers, complaint IDs, inspection results, lawsuit captions, insurance claim numbers. Whenever a line matched, same photo, same wording, same damage, he made a small star in the margin. Soon, the page bristled with stars. By the end of the week, his pattern had a posture. Blackwell Properties bought distressed buildings. Blackwell's managers scheduled inspections that cataloged every failing. The boiler that shuddered and died, the hairline fractures spreading like frost across ceilings, the slow brown tears of the pipes. Those inspections lived in city drawers and on hard drives. Then the units were rented. Tenants complained. Lawsuits followed, each echoing the last down to the adjectives. Malik laid 3 complaints from 3 buildings in a row and read aloud to himself, a finger under the lines, "Gross tenant negligence resulted in structural compromise of wall assembly. Gross tenant negligence resulted in structural compromise of wall assembly. Gross tenant negligence resulted in structural compromise of wall assembly." Copy and paste. Insert new name. File again. He underlined gross tenant negligence in each, feeling the words grow thinner with every repetition. At the back of a housing code manual, he penciled a short, stubborn line. They industrialized the lie. The tenants kept coming. Word of the boy with the briefcase traveled down stairwells and across laundromats, through grocery aisles and church basements. In the evenings, Sarah sat at the table with a cheap spiral notebook taking names and phone numbers as if she were an intake desk at a clinic. "My daughter's asthma," Gloria Rodriguez said, laying inhaler receipts and ER discharge papers on the formica. The mold was everywhere. Earl Washington brought a dog-eared folder of maintenance requests stamped, received, and closed on the same day. "They closed the tickets without fixing a damn thing," he said, embarrassed to be angry in front of a child, but too tired to be anything else. Mary Lane, 80 and steady as a metronome, arrived with a cookie tin that contained neat index cards. She had logged every thermostat reading of the winter. "I wrote the time next to each one," she told Malik, tapping the pencil marks. "You can see the nights it dropped below 55. Malik didn't promise anyone a miracle. He promised to look. He promised to organize. He promised to remember. He scanned what they brought, tucked copies behind labeled tabs, and, when he had to, pressed the originals back into their hands with care, the way a librarian returns a rare book. When the kitchen chairs were full, neighbors stood in the hallway holding photographs and letters. The weight of other people's lives settled across Malik's shoulders. He squared them and kept writing. He knew the shape of Blackwell's scheme now. What he didn't yet have was the lever big enough to pry the system open in one motion. The courthouse had told him which judge would hear Sarah's case. Everyone in Montgomery County Housing Court knew what that meant. So he went hunting for the lever. Public disclosures are dull by design. Malik worked through them anyway. Tables of interests, contributions in polite columns, tiny boxes for yes, no. Judges file them every year. Most people never read them. That night, the library lights had been dimmed for closing when he found the line that made the room feel too small. Foreign and domestic equity, retirement account, Blackwell Properties, Inc. 500 shares. He reread it until the words blurred. Then he turned the page. Clubs and associations, Pinehurst Country Club, dues paid by Montgomery County Landlords Association. He set his pencil down to keep from snapping it. The page felt warm under his palm. He whispered the words as if saying them made them less absurd. Stock in the plaintiff's company, dues paid by the plaintiff's lobby. He looked up at the dark window and saw his reflection, a small boy in an oversized hoodie, lone silhouette in a room of sleeping books. He drew a box around both entries and wrote, in careful print, Canon 3, Duty to Disqualify. The lever wasn't just big. It was the right size, in the right place. Back home, he spread the disclosures on the table beside the inspection reports and lawsuits. He drew arrows until the white space disappeared. Inspections, leasing, complaints, lawsuits, insurance payouts. Along the bottom, he added a second line. Golf, dues, decisions, evictions. Sarah came in quietly, carrying 2 steaming cups. Chamomile, she said. Doctor's orders. You should sleep, Malik said without looking up. So should you. She set the cup beside him, followed the arrows with her eyes, and stopped at the final box. What's this one? Recusal, he said. If a judge has a financial interest in the case, any interest, they can't hear it. That's the rule. And if he refuses, then the rule becomes the story. He tucked the disclosures into a sleeve labeled Judicial Conflicts, Williams' ready copy, and felt his stomach flip at the last name. He didn't know who would take the bench if Crenshaw stepped down. He only knew it couldn't be him. Sarah exhaled slowly, then squeezed his shoulder. Whatever happens, we tell the truth. We tell it under oath, he answered. The next day he stopped being a student of documents and started being a custodian of them. He printed duplicates and stamped them exhibit copy. He annotated a clean set for himself with notes like Ask Gloria about Unit C12 photos and get Mary's index cards in timeline. He created a witness list and put stars next to names likely to withstand cross-examination without freezing. He typed a 1-page theory of the case. Fraud disguised as routine eviction, enabled by judicial conflict. Tenants harmed, pattern provable through public records. He practiced saying it aloud until the cadence fit in his mouth without stumbling. Mr. Lewis found him at the microfilm machine again and shook his head. Kid, you're building a skyscraper out of paper. Out of facts, Malik said. Paper's just the scaffolding. Lewis chuckled. And who taught you to talk like that? My mom, Malik said, matter of fact, and kept feeding film. Blackwell noticed. You could tell because the calls started. Sarah lost her evening delivery route first. Insurance liability, her manager said, eyes not quite meeting hers. The grocery store cut her hours. The office building shifted to a new vendor. None of the conversations said Blackwell's name out loud. They didn't need to. He's squeezing us, Sarah said, voice flat with tired fury. Malik printed the termination emails, slipped them into damages, retaliation, and drew a line under the entry. Then we'll show the squeeze. That afternoon, a letter arrived from Morrison, Sterling, and Associates on paper thick as business cards. It demanded immediate vacation of the premises in exchange for consideration, waiver of damages, and warned that continuation of frivolous defenses will result in sanctions. Malik read it twice, then clipped it to offers. Coercive. If they want us quiet, he said, we're getting loud. Neighbors began bringing him things he hadn't known to ask for. Insurance adjuster forms, photos from move-in days, texts from property managers promising repairs next week. He arranged them in chronological order and felt the narrative tighten. "Look," he told Sarah, pulling one sequence close. They inspected in June, leased the unit in August, promised repairs by September, filed suit in December, and in between, he fanned the unanswered maintenance tickets like a bad hand of cards. Nothing. Sarah traced the dates with a fingertip. "If a jury saw this, they won't," Malik said. "Housing court is bench trials. The judge decides, which is why the judge matters." He flipped the binder to the tab he'd labeled recusal motion and read the short paragraph he'd drafted, heart steadying with each familiar word. To preserve the appearance and reality of impartial justice, respondent respectfully moves for disqualification pursuant to Canon 3 and applicable state law. He didn't have to be tall to stand on principle. He only had to stand. On the eve of the hearing, the apartment felt wrapped in cotton. The world outside softened to a hush of tires and distant sirens. Malik laid out his suit on the back of a chair. Jacket sleeves a little too long, collar too big, knot practice visible in faint ridges on the tie. He packed his briefcase, exhibits, witness list, motion to recuse, open and outline. He slid a chess pawn into the smallest pocket, not for luck, but to remind himself to think 3 moves ahead. Sarah watched him tuck the last folder inside. "You sure about the part with the judge?" she asked. He nodded. "If we don't say it, no one will. And if it makes him angry?" "It already made him comfortable," Malik said. "That's worse." She smiled, small and fierce. "That's something your grandmother would have said." They ate quietly. After, he checked the binder one more time. Exhibit A through N. He touched each tab like a rosary. At the door to his room, he hesitated. "Mama." "If I forget something tomorrow, will you squeeze my hand?" "I'll squeeze it anyway," she said, "just so you know I'm here." Sleep came in clipped reels. He dreamed of narrow hallways and doors that opened into rooms full of files. In every room, a man in a blue suit laughed without making a sound. When he woke, the sky was the color of paper before ink. He dressed, combed his hair, and stood in front of the mirror until the knot in his tie behaved. The briefcase felt heavy, but on him it looked right, like a tool, not a costume. Sarah buttoned her coat with slow fingers and tucked her hospital bracelet into a drawer. At the threshold, she paused to turn off the lamp, the little island of light finally going dark. On the sidewalk, a breath of cold air steadied them. They walked in step down the block, past the corner where the bus stop sign leaned, past the bodega with the bell that rang twice on entry, past the notice board where a flyer for Thompson Family Legal Clinic. Saturdays did not yet exist. At the bus stop, Malik looked up at the slice of courthouse rising from the street 3 stops ahead. "Today we show them the pattern," he said. Sarah squeezed his hand. "Today we show them you." He shook his head gently. "No, Mama, we show them us." The bus sighed to a stop. They climbed aboard, found 2 seats together, and set the briefcase on their knees like a shared promise. As the city rolled past the window, brick and winter trees and faces that had learned not to stare, Malik pictured the courtroom's wood and the judge's high bench, and he arranged the words he would say in his head, placing them like chess pieces where they needed to be. He did not imagine applause. He did not imagine headlines. He imagined a table, a binder, a microphone, a boy's voice steady on the record, and the slow, irreversible click of truth fitting into place. The courthouse steps rose to meet them. He took the first one, then the next, the rhythm of paper under his arm and purpose in his breath. All the way to the doors where, tomorrow morning, the system that had learned to look past people like him would have to look at him and listen. The morning of the hearing broke clear and cold, sunlight glinting off the courthouse's marble steps like a blade. News vans crowded the curb, microphones sprouting toward the entrance as reporters called out questions. Word of the boy lawyer had turned a simple eviction case into a public spectacle. Inside, courtroom 3B, the air was thick with anticipation. The gallery overflowed. Tenants, journalists, courthouse clerks who'd come in early just to watch. At one table sat Sarah Thompson, clutching her purse, eyes swollen from sleepless nights. Beside her, wearing his too big brown suit and clutching a scuffed briefcase, was Malik. Across from them, Preston Blackwell lounged with arrogant composure, his dark suit immaculate, his lawyers, 5 of them, lined in a row. The lead counsel, Richard Sterling, adjusted his cufflinks and smiled like he already knew how this would end. At 9 sharp, Judge Harold Crenshaw entered. "Court is now in session," he announced, voice booming. "Let's make this quick." He glanced at Malik, disdain curling his lips. "Children do not practice law in my courtroom." Malik rose slowly. "Your Honor, under Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 17C, I appear as next friend on behalf of my mother, who is unable to represent herself due to medical incapacity. The clerk of the court has accepted this filing." The room went still. Crenshaw blinked, unprepared for the formality of the boy's language. Sterling stood. "Your Honor, this is absurd. Allowing a child to pretend to be a lawyer makes a mockery of justice." Crenshaw nodded in agreement. "I concur, Mr. Sterling." "With respect, Your Honor," Malik interjected, his small voice steady but resonant. "Before you dismiss this proceeding, please cite the statute that requires an age limit for next friend representation." The judge opened his mouth, then closed it again. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Crenshaw cleared his throat. "Proceed, briefly." Malik nodded once. "Thank you, Your Honor. Truth doesn't require much time, only proof." Sterling began the prosecution's argument with performative outrage. He displayed glossy photographs of cracked walls, mold blooms, and ceiling stains. "This family caused over $50,000 in damages," he declared, letting his voice rise dramatically. "Negligence, destruction, a complete disregard for property." He turned, gesturing at Sarah like a ringmaster revealing a trick. "The evidence speaks for itself." The gallery whispered approval. Crenshaw leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. When Sterling sat, Malik stood. "Your Honor, the evidence does speak, but not the way Mr. Sterling thinks." He opened his briefcase and laid out photos printed on cheap paper. "These were taken by my mother on move-in day 2 years ago. The same cracks, same stains, same damage." He held one side by side with Sterling's glossy exhibits. "These problems existed long before we arrived." The gallery murmured louder this time, skeptical shifting toward belief. Sterling jumped up. "Objection! Those photos can't be verified." "They're time-stamped," Malik said calmly, sliding the printouts forward. "Metadata included. You'll find them consistent with the city's inspection archive." He placed another document on the evidence table. "Inspection report, dated 3 months before occupancy, confirming the same defects." Judge Crenshaw's jaw tightened. "Where did you obtain this report?" "Public records, Your Honor," Malik said simply. "Anyone can access them, though some might prefer they remain buried." A ripple of unease swept across the courtroom. Sterling frowned, whispering to Blackwell. Malik pressed forward. "Mr. Blackwell sued my mother for damage he already knew existed. He repeated this same lawsuit against multiple tenants using identical evidence, sometimes the same photographs. He held up 3 separate complaints. Identical wording, copy and paste, a fraud disguised as law." Sterling slammed his fist on the table. "This is slander." "No, sir," Malik said, his tone still soft. It's pattern recognition. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Crenshaw banged his gavel. Order. Malik stepped closer to the bench. Your Honor, before we continue, I must raise a serious concern regarding potential conflicts of interest affecting this case. Every head turned. I have documentation showing that you, Judge Crenshaw, own stock in Blackwell Properties and have your annual dues at Pinehurst Country Club paid by the Montgomery County Landlords Association, which Mr. Blackwell chairs. The silence was absolute. Crenshaw's face turned gray. That is an outrageous accusation. They're public disclosures, Malik said quietly, holding up the documents, signed under penalty of perjury. The gavel trembled in Crenshaw's hand. Court will recess 30 minutes. The hallway exploded in sound. Reporters sprinted for their cameras. Tenants crowded around Sarah shouting encouragement. You get them, baby, Mrs. Rodriguez cried. Blackwell stormed toward Malik, eyes burning. You have no idea who you're dealing with, kid. I'll destroy you and your mother. Malik didn't flinch. Are you threatening a witness, Mr. Blackwell? That's obstruction of justice. Security stepped in. Cameras flashed as Blackwell was pulled away, shouting curses. Sarah crouched down in front of her son. Malik, what you just did? Her voice shook. He's powerful. You could get hurt. He looked at her, eyes calm and resolute. Mama, power means nothing without truth. They built this system on fear. It's time someone stood up. She took his face in her hands. Then we stand together. When the courtroom reopened, a new judge took the bench. The nameplate read Honorable Patricia Williams. Her reputation was legend. Fair, incorruptible, feared by crooked attorneys. This court has been reassigned, she said briskly. Judge Crenshaw has recused himself due to verified financial conflicts. Proceed, Mr. Thompson. Malik nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. He began again, methodically walking the court through his evidence, inspection dates, public filings, fraudulent patterns, insurance records. As he spoke, the audience leaned forward, hanging on every word. When Malik rested his case, Judge Williams set down her pen. Mr. Blackwell, please rise. The landlord stood stiff and pale. This court finds overwhelming evidence of fraud, negligence, and judicial misconduct in the handling of this case, Williams said. Judgment is entered in favor of the defendants, Sarah and Malik Thompson. Sarah gasped. Malik closed his eyes, the briefcase slipping from his grip. The gavel came down one final time. Furthermore, punitive damages of $500,000 are awarded to the defendants, and a criminal investigation into Blackwell Properties and associated parties is hereby initiated. The courtroom erupted in cheers. Reporters rushed the aisle. Tenants wept openly. Blackwell slumped into his chair, face blank, empire collapsing in real time. Judge Williams glanced at Malik. Mr. Thompson, do you have anything to add? Malik straightened. Yes, Your Honor. My mother taught me that right is right, even when no one believes you. I just wanted to prove she was right. The judge smiled faintly. You did more than that, young man. You reminded this court what justice is supposed to look like. When they stepped out of the courthouse, flashbulbs exploded like fireworks. The crowd parted as mother and son descended the marble stairs. Reporters shouted, Malik, how does it feel to win? He smiled shyly. It's not about winning, it's about fairness. Everyone deserves a voice. Behind him, Sarah wept quietly, not from sadness, but from pride. That night, headlines blazed across every screen. 9-year-old exposes county's biggest landlord fraud. Boy lawyer forces judge to resign. And in a small apartment on Riverside Street, The light stayed on late into the night because Mullick Thompson was already drafting something new, a plan to make sure no one ever had to fight alone again. The courthouse steps were still crowded hours after the verdict. Reporters shouted questions into the winter air, camera flashes popping like lightning. "Mullick, how does it feel to be the youngest person to win a housing fraud case? Mrs. Thompson, what's next for you and your son?" Mullick stood beside his mother, dwarfed by the sea of microphones. His small hands gripped his briefcase as though it were a part of him. Sarah, tears glimmering in her eyes, bent down and whispered, "Baby, you did it. You saved us." Mullick looked up at her, his expression steady but gentle. "No, Mama. We saved each other." The crowd roared with applause as Judge Williams exited the building behind them, reporters turning their attention to her. But the judge only said one thing: "Justice doesn't depend on age or power. It depends on courage." That single line echoed across headlines the next morning. By evening, every major news network was covering the story. Boy lawyer exposes judicial corruption. Landlord empire collapses after 9-year-old's court victory. Cable anchors spoke Mullick's name like it belonged to history. Across the country, people watched clips of him standing in front of the judge, speaking with composure and conviction far beyond his years. Social media exploded with praise and disbelief. But while the world celebrated, Mullick was quiet. He sat on the couch beside his mother, watching the flickering TV screen as reporters replayed his every word. Sarah turned the volume down. "You okay, baby?" Mullick nodded slowly. "It doesn't feel like winning," he said. "It feels like finishing a really long homework assignment that shouldn't have existed." Sarah smiled softly. "Sometimes the hardest lessons aren't for school." A week later, the Montgomery County District Attorney's Office opened a full criminal investigation into Preston Blackwell and his network of companies. Court documents revealed what Mullick had already pieced together: years of forged inspection reports, fraudulent lawsuits, and falsified insurance claims totaling millions. Blackwell's name vanished from luxury real estate listings and reappeared in indictments. His properties were seized, his accounts frozen. 2 of his top managers turned state's evidence. By spring, he was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for fraud, extortion, and obstruction of justice. As for Judge Harold Crenshaw, the scandal forced his resignation. Judicial oversight committees uncovered a web of conflicts of interest, bribery, and decades of unethical rulings. He was stripped of his pension and disbarred from ever practicing law again. For the families who had suffered under his rulings, it wasn't revenge, it was relief. The Thompson family, however, did not seek fame. Sarah used a portion of their court award to move them into a modest home on the other side of town. For the first time, their windows opened without mold, their water ran clear, and their heater worked. But Sarah didn't stop there. Within months, she founded the Thompson Family Legal Advocacy Center, a small nonprofit providing free assistance to families facing eviction. The office sat in a converted storefront on the Jefferson Avenue, its walls covered with handwritten notes from grateful tenants. "Thank you for helping us keep our home. You gave us hope." Sarah's desk was cluttered with case files and coffee mugs, but she never complained. She worked tirelessly, often past midnight, just like Mullick once did for her. Sometimes, when she felt overwhelmed, she would glance at the framed newspaper headline above her desk: "A 9-year-old boy who reminded the system what justice means." 5 years later, the ivy-covered walls of Harvard Law School glowed under the afternoon sun. Inside the LeWu, Library, a young man sat surrounded by law books, his focus unbroken. Malik Thompson, now 14, had become the youngest student ever admitted to Harvard in over a century. Professors whispered about his brilliance, but Malik avoided the spotlight. He didn't study for prestige. He studied because the world still had too many Blackwells, and too few people willing to fight them. When a journalist came to interview him, Malik's answers were calm and thoughtful. "What made you want to become a lawyer?" He smiled faintly. "I didn't want to become one," he said. "I just didn't want anyone else to feel powerless. Once you see how the system works, you can't unsee it. You have to do something." Meanwhile, back in Montgomery County, Mrs. Rodriguez won her own case against Blackwell's insurance companies for her daughter's medical bills. Mr. Washington founded a tenant rights organization that helped hundreds avoid eviction. Mary Lane, the elderly tenant who once shivered through the winters, celebrated her 80th birthday in a warm, fully repaired apartment. The county had changed. Courtrooms that once silenced tenants now required evidence before eviction. Judges were required to disclose financial interests publicly. And, across the state, Malik's case became mandatory reading in law schools under the title Thompson v. Blackwell Properties, a study in judicial ethics and systemic reform. Years later, Malik stood outside his old apartment building on Riverside Avenue. The walls had been repainted, the air clean, the broken pipes replaced. He ran his hand along the brick, remembering nights under the flickering lamp, whispering legal codes while his mother slept. Sarah joined him, older now but radiant with pride. "Feels smaller than I remember," she said. Malik smiled. "That's because we outgrew it." They stood there a moment longer, watching children chase each other in the courtyard where Malik once dreamed of fairness. Sarah looked at him. "Do you ever miss being that little boy with the briefcase?" "Every day," he admitted. "He was fearless." She laughed. "He still is." That evening, Malik gave a speech at a community center filled with students, single parents, and young lawyers inspired by his story. Cameras streamed it live, but his tone was simple, heartfelt. "People ask what it feels like to win," he said. "But winning isn't justice. Justice is when no one else has to fight the same battle you did." He paused, scanning the faces before him. Courage doesn't come from power. It comes from love, from knowing someone's counting on you to do the right thing, even when it's hard. That's what my mom taught me. He looked toward Sarah, who sat in the front row, tears glistening. And that's what this story has always been about. Not a boy versus a system, but a family who refused to stop believing that truth matters. Applause rose, loud and unending. Long after the lights dimmed and the hall emptied, Malik lingered on the stage. He opened his old briefcase, its leather cracked and corners frayed, and took out the chess pawn he'd carried to every hearing. He placed it in his palm, remembering his own words years ago. Sometimes the smallest pieces change the whole game. Then he smiled, slipped it back inside, and whispered, "Your move, world." Years passed, but the story of Malik Thompson never faded. What began as a desperate fight to save one home became a movement that changed a nation. Across the United States, families who once lived in silence now spoke out against corrupt landlords and predatory courts. Reporters called it the Thompson Effect. Law schools taught it as the case that redefined justice. But to Malik, it was simply his mother's lesson written in history. Never stop standing for what's right. It had been 10 years since that cold morning in Montgomery County. The old courthouse had been renovated, its walls scrubbed clean of mold, and its name changed to the Patricia Williams Justice Center. At the building's heart stood a marble statue, a young boy holding a briefcase, his mother beside him, one hand on his shoulder. The inscription read, "To those who fight with truth as their only weapon." In honor of Malik and Sarah Thompson, 2015. On the day of the unveiling, the crowd spilled into the streets. Judges, lawyers, teachers, and former tenants gathered under a cloudless sky. Malik, now 19, stood quietly beside his mother. He had grown tall, his voice calm and deep, but his eyes still carried the same fire they did the day he stood before Judge Crenshaw. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she reached for his arm. "It doesn't feel real," she whispered. "All those nights we couldn't even afford heat, and now—" Malik smiled softly. "Now, the same system that ignored us is learning from us." The ceremony began with speeches, officials praising Malik's courage, professors recounting how his case had redefined judicial ethics. But when the microphone was passed to him, the noise faded into silence. He looked at the crowd, at the faces of strangers who now saw him as a symbol, and said quietly, "I never wanted to be a symbol. I just wanted my mother to sleep without fear." He paused, letting the words settle. But fear only disappears when truth stands taller. And truth doesn't care about your age, your money, or your title. It just needs a voice. The crowd erupted into applause. Cameras clicked. Somewhere near the front, an older man in a janitor's uniform wiped his eyes. It was Mr. Lewis, the night guard who once kept the library open for Malik. When the speeches ended, Malik walked over to him. "You broke the rules for me once," he said with a grin. "I never forgot." Mr. Lewis chuckled, his voice hoarse. "And look what it started." That night, Malik and Sarah returned home to their small but warm house on Jefferson Avenue. The walls were lined with framed photos. Students, volunteers, families who had won their cases with help from the Thompson Family Legal Center. Sarah moved slower now, her hair streaked with silver, but her pride glowed brighter than ever. She sat at the kitchen table, running her fingers over a newspaper headline pinned on the wall. "From Eviction to Revolution, How One Boy Rebuilt the Meaning of Justice." Malik poured her tea and sat across from her. "You know, Mama, sometimes I wonder if it's enough. The law's changed, but people still struggle. There's always another Blackwell out there." She looked at him with a knowing smile. "There's always darkness, baby, but you taught people how to light candles." He exhaled, leaning back. "You taught me first." 2 years later, the first National Tenant Rights Conference opened in Washington, D.C. The keynote speaker was none other than Malik Thompson, now 21, a Harvard Law graduate, and the youngest attorney ever appointed to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. The auditorium buzzed with energy as thousands gathered. His speech wasn't long, but every word struck deep. Justice isn't a courtroom, it's a commitment. Laws can punish wrongdoing, but only people can prevent it. And every person here has the power to protect someone else's home, someone else's dignity. That's how we win. Not once, but forever. When he finished, the audience rose to its feet. It wasn't the applause that mattered, it was the unity that followed. Across the country, community centers opened, legal aid programs expanded, and schools began teaching civic education inspired by Malik's work. His mother watched the broadcast from their living room, hand over her heart. "You did it, baby," she whispered. "You turned pain into purpose." But Malik never forgot where it began. Every anniversary of the trial, he returned to the old neighborhood, the one that once crumbled under mold and neglect, now bright with gardens and laughter. Children rode bikes past murals painted with his likeness. A small plaque near the playground read, He was 9 years old when the world told him to stay quiet. He spoke anyway. He visited Mrs. Rodriguez, now a grandmother. He shared coffee with Mr. Washington, who still ran the Tenants Coalition, and before heading home, he always stopped by the steps of Building C, where he'd first dreamed of changing the system. He'd stand there, looking up at the windows glowing in the dusk, and whisper, "We did it, Mama. We really did." Years later, when Sarah passed away peacefully in her sleep, the entire city mourned. Thousands attended her memorial service. Former clients, students, and neighbors filled the streets carrying candles. Malik stood at the podium, tears streaking his face. "My mother believed in people who had nothing left to believe in," he said. "She gave her strength to others until the world learned to give it back." He looked at the crowd and smiled faintly through his grief. "She used to say, 'We're not meant to change the world all at once, just the piece of it we can reach.' And she reached farther than anyone." 10 more years passed. The Thompson Center expanded to 6 states, providing free legal representation to tens of thousands of families. Malik, now 31, led national reform efforts, shaping federal housing laws to protect the poor and expose corruption. But every day, on his desk, sat one old, worn object, a cracked leather briefcase with the faded initials, MT. Inside it, tucked in the smallest pocket, was the chess pawn he once carried into court. It reminded him of everything: fear, courage, justice, love. And when young lawyers visited his office for advice, he'd open the briefcase, show them the pawn, and say, This was my reminder that even the smallest piece can change the whole game." That evening, as he left the Thompson Center and stepped into the twilight, Malik glanced up at the courthouse where it all began. Its lights glowed against the skyline like watchful eyes. He smiled. The system that once silenced his mother now bore her name on its doors. The boy who once begged for fairness had become its guardian. And somewhere, deep in the quiet of his soul, he heard her voice again. "Tell the truth, baby. Always." He whispered back, "Always, Mama." And as he walked away into the night, the wind carried his words through the city streets, a promise kept, a legacy reborn. Sometimes the smallest voice can expose the biggest corruption. If you believe courage can change the world, like, share and subscribe to Blacktail Stories for more powerful true stories.